describe what you saw at Clint, where now 100 kids are being sent back in after the government said they took out 300.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Amy. You know, I was there as part of a team of lawyers and doctors who volunteer to monitor these facilities on behalf of the Flores settlement, which is a decades-old legal settlement between the government and lawyers for children who are detained by immigration enforcement. And as part of that settlement, we don't actually have access to the locations, or to the facility where, to the whole facility where children are being detained. What we can do is speak to them because they're class members. Basically, they are clients. So we were sort of placed in this anodyne, interview room and given a roster of children who were in the facility. And when we got there on Monday, we got this roster, and it showed that there were over 350 children in the facility from 0 to 17 years old. And so we said, okay, we're just going to start calling the youngest kids. We're going to start calling the kids who, the young parents. There were some young mothers there with infants. And we're going to try to talk to the kids who it appears, based on this list, may have been here for the longest. And when the kids came into the interview rooms where we were sitting, one of the things we noticed was that we were calling kids who were listed as being 2 or 3 years old, and they were indeed alone in the facility. They would come into the interview room, usually together with a somewhat older kid, and the agents would say, "Oh, this kid is taking care of that other kid." And indeed, what the kids said was, if you talk to the older kid, often these toddlers were pre-verbal. "Oh yeah, I've been taking care of, taking care of this toddler, because there's no one else to do it, and they're in my cell with me. So, I've been, changing their diapers, giving them food, making sure they're okay." And that was sort of how those interviews went. We ended up understanding from the kids that many had been there for weeks, and the kid who had been there the longest, who we spoke with, had been there for 26 days, and that's staying in these conditions that are really inappropriate for anyone for that amount of time, much less for a child. They hadn't been able to change their clothes for the most part. If they had gotten a shower or a bath, it was on the level of, say, once a week. Same thing with toothbrushes. In fact, they would say, we were allowed to brush our teeth, say, once a week, but then they told us we had to throw away the toothbrushes because you can't have them in the cell because they're contraband. So they wouldn't let them sort of take that kind of item back into these jail cells. A lot of them said, there are some beds, there are some mattresses, but kids do also have to sleep on the floor because they're just not enough. That's the facility that, after we decided that it was so urgent, we had to speak out. Oh, let me say just quickly, the other thing that really concerned us from the perspective of urgency was that many of the kids we called were visibly sick, running noses. Some of the younger kids had mucus-stained clothing. And then many of the kids we asked to speak with, they said, no, you can't speak with that child because they're in quarantine. We said, we'll go to the quarantine room, no problem. We'll send some team members to the quarantine room and have them immediately leave the facility if you're worried about us spreading infectious diseases. They said no, they never gave us access to these quarantine rooms, and we called a sort of a significant number of kids, almost, I believe 10 kids at least, who they said we couldn't see because they were in quarantine. At one point, I had this really quiet second grader who came into the interview room, and she sort of sat, she came in and she sat on this big office chair, and she was like grabbing the sides of the chair. She was like sort of bracing herself. And I asked her one question. I said, hello, I invited her, to speak, and asked if she wanted to speak, and she said, oh, okay. And I said, who'd you cross the border with? And she said, my aunt. And then she just started crying so hard that she couldn't produce words. And, trying to calm her down, rubbing her back and looking and seeing that she had a bracelet on with the words in permanent marker, the words U.S. parent and a phone number. Someone had taken the time to write that down, I guess, when they separated her from her adult relative, her custodian with whom she crossed the border. So I at that point, there's this sense that you're not allowed to use your phone in the facilities. But at that point, I and other members of our team just decided, screw that. We're gonna start making phone calls. So picked up my phone and dialed the number and connected with her father, and he had no idea where she was being held. They were able to speak, and after that, she was able to sort of ask for more phone calls because she realized that phone calls might be a possibility.
How many of these kids had bracelets that had their parents' phone numbers written directly on them?
She was the only one who I saw with a bracelet with the parents' phone number, but there were so many kids who do have parents in the United States. I mean, another group of brothers who I spoke with had traveled with an older sibling to the U.S., a 19-year-old sister, and the sister was the one who had the parents' contact information, but they separated these kids from their adult sister so suddenly at the border that they were left with none of their parents' contact information, and they were distraught. They felt like they would maybe never connect with their parents again. And so for them, I was able to hook up my phone and hotspot and went on Facebook and sent a bunch of messages to the people, the profiles they identified as their father and their aunt, and someone got back to me, and we were able to, get the number and give their dad a call and send them, back to their cells at least with a paper that had the number.
And where are these, when the children leave that facility, where do they get sent?
So the children who are leaving that facility are going to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is under a different agency, the Health and Human Services Agency. And they're going into what is now a extremely bloated set of detention centers and shelters. That's the custody that's being considered, for example, at Fort Sill. These sort of large detention centers are the new norm, really, under the Trump administration, like the one in Homestead, Florida, being run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. I've been doing visits in those facilities as well, and the real problems that we're seeing there have to do with extremely extended lengths of stay, especially under the Trump administration. They've really slowed down the process to reunify children with family members in the United States, and a lot of that has to do with the administration's desire and policy to use the information of people who come forward to take care of children and get them out of these detention centers for immigration enforcement purposes. So to arrest, detain, and deport the people who come forward to take care of them.